Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses. Discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 94. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 66 and 67 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the equality among the virtues and of the duration of virtues after this life. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether one virtue can be greater or less than another. Some virtues can be greater in themselves than another, like charity. The supernatural habitual love of God would be of a superior order than the natural virtue of temperance, for example. Also, an individual virtue can be greater or less in one person than another, and for the reasons given by St. Thomas, he says, because one man is better disposed than another to attain to the mean of virtue on account of either greater habituation or a better natural disposition or a more discerning judgment of reason, or again a greater gift of grace. And when it comes to the intellectual virtues, such as one's habitual knowledge of science, that habit can be greater in one than another in its extent to more content or detail within a particular branch of knowledge. All that being said, I think the key takeaway from this article is that according to St. Thomas, we call someone virtuous as they approach the mean established by right reason. And since there can be more or less in that proximity to the mean, then also in this way we can call one more virtuous than another. In St. Thomas's words, and here the Stoics erred, for they held that no man should be deemed virtuous unless he were in the highest degree disposed to virtue. The nature of virtue does not require that man should reach the mean of right reason as though it were an indivisible point, but it is enough that he should approach the mean. Moreover, one same indivisible mark is reached more nearly and more readily by one than another, as may be seen when several archers aim at a fixed target. Article 2, whether all the virtues that are together in one man are equal. Some virtues are better in themselves than others in the one man, insofar as their effects are better than others, or as they are more directly related to reason than others, which would make the virtue of charity greater than faith, for example, or the virtue of prudence greater than temperance. But the insight to be gained from this article is really summarized in the following quote from Augustine. If you say these men are equal in fortitude, but that one is more prudent than another, it follows that the fortitude of the latter is less prudent. Consequently, they are not really equal in fortitude, since the former's fortitude is more prudent. You will find that this applies to the other virtues if you run over them all in the same way, which is a profound insight that has been something like a chorus for us, repeated by Aquinas in various ways over the last couple of episodes, that the virtues presuppose and are connected to one another in such a way that they must increase or decrease together as a kind of cohesive whole. And the only time this would not be the case, according to St. Thomas, is if there was some other factor causing a particular readiness to some particular virtue, whether it be by nature or habit or by the grace of God. However, our final word in this article is really Augustine's, who says, and not contrary to Aquinas, those who are equal in fortitude are equal in prudence and temperance also. Article 3, whether the moral virtues are better than the intellectual virtues. In a couple sentences from Aquinas and in response to this article, he says, moral virtue is in that part of the soul which is rational by participation, while intellectual virtue is in the essentially rational part. Now, rational by essence is more excellent than rational by participation. Therefore, intellectual virtue is better than moral virtue. Article 4, whether justice is the chief of the moral virtues. And it is, because we take something to be a moral virtue, strictly speaking, as it modifies the will or flows from the will. And the one virtue among the four cardinal virtues which affects the will directly is the virtue of justice. Prudence is a virtue of the mind, and temperance and fortitude are dispositions in the sensitive appetite, the passions. Justice also has for its object an operation, rendering to one his or her due, which sets a man aright, not only in regard to himself, but also in regard to his neighbor. And so, based on justice's subject, the will, and its object, just operation, it can be said to be chief or most excellent among the moral virtues. Article 5, whether wisdom is the greatest of the intellectual virtues. As answered briefly by St. Thomas, the greatness of a virtue, as to its species, or kind, we could say, is taken from its object. Now, the object of wisdom surpasses the objects of all the intellectual virtues, because wisdom considers the supreme cause, which is God, as stated at the beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And since it is by the cause that we judge an effect, and by the higher cause that we judge the lower effects, hence it is that wisdom exercises judgment over all the other intellectual virtues, directs them all, and is the architect of them all. Article 6, whether charity is the greatest of the theological virtues. In a word from St. Paul, so faith, hope, and charity abide, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. And this is the case not only because, like wisdom, charity has for its object God himself, which would also be the case with faith and hope, but also because in this life it is greater to love God than to know him, and that on account of the limits of our knowledge in this life. As St. Paul will say, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. However, right now, the supernatural, habitual love of God, which is charity, is allowing us to possess him as he is. Because as St. Thomas says, the love of charity is of that which is already possessed, since the beloved is, in a manner, in the lover. And again, the lover is drawn by desire to union with the beloved. Hence it is written in 1 John 4:16, he that abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him. Yet in regard to faith and hope, St. Thomas says, faith is of what is not seen, and hope is of what is not possessed. And therefore, St. Paul is correct in saying, the greatest of these is charity. And now on to question 67 of the duration of virtues after this life. Article 1, whether the moral virtues remain after this life. A moral virtue consists of a material element and a formal element. Those are the specific terms for what it is composed of. That's the material element. And what makes it what it is, that's the formal element. You and I receive our existence materially from our parents and formally from our soul created by God, informing the particular matter of our particular body. So too in the moral virtues, the material element is a certain inclination of the appetitive faculty towards passion or operation, and the formal element is that inclination's agreement with right reason. So what is temperance? It is a certain disposition of the appetitive faculty, specifically here the concupiscible passions, to be in accord with right reason. So going back to our article, we could ask, will temperance, for example, remain after death? And not when one is in a disembodied state, unless we consider it rooted in the will, because the passions themselves entail the body, which we lose, obviously, after death. However, virtues like justice, which dispose the will directly, will remain both in the disembodied state as well as in the general resurrection, as St. Thomas says. Of justice, it is specifically said that it is perpetual and immortal, both by reason of its subject, since the will is incorruptible, and because its act will not change, as we have stated. Article 2, whether the intellectual virtues remain after this life. Will our habitual knowledge, which is gained in this life, remain in the next? And Aquinas holds that it will, not only based on Scripture, where we see the wealthy man of Luke 16 remembering after death things of his former life, but also because the potential intellect, once it receives the knowledge of a thing, continues to hold it in memory, even when one is not actually considering that thing. And since the intellect is an immaterial faculty, it is not necessarily or essentially dependent upon the body, nor housed in a bodily organ, then there is no reason to hold that it would not retain this habitual knowledge it gained in this life after the body decays. And for more on the intellect in general, I would see episodes 39 through 41, as well as episode 46 of this podcast. Article 3, whether faith remains after this life. The short answer is no, and given in the following words in this article: faith of its very nature contains an imperfection on the part of the subject, that the believer sees not what he believes, whereas bliss of its very nature implies perfection on the part of the subject, that the blessed see that which makes them happy. Hence it is manifest that faith and bliss are incompatible in one and the same subject. Article 4, whether hope remains after death in the state of glory. No again, and in a word. St. Paul says in Romans 8:24, who hopes for what he sees? But the blessed see that which is the object of hope, God. Therefore they do not hope. Article 5, whether anything of faith or hope remains in glory. Aquinas tells us here that in regard to faith, just as when you take away the specific difference from a general category, the species changes. For example, when you take away the specific difference of rational from the general category of animal, you no longer have a human being. Then since the knowledge of faith is an obscure knowledge of God, and the knowledge from the beatific vision is a clear knowledge of God, then in the beatific vision, the knowledge received by faith will not remain specifically nor be identical to that knowledge received via the beatific vision, and only then be similar to it, generally speaking. As St. Thomas puts it, it is therefore evident that in heaven nothing remains of faith, either identically or specifically the same, but only generically. And when it comes to hope, since it is not even within the same category of attainment, then in the life of glory, it is entirely taken away. As St. Thomas says, on the other hand, hope is not of the same genus as heavenly bliss, because it is compared to the enjoyment of bliss as movement is to rest in the term of movement. Article 6, and our final article, whether charity remains after this life in glory. And it does, because it is not only generally identical to the love of God we will have, God willing, in the life to come, but it is specifically the same. And Aquinas proves that by writing, the object of charity is not knowledge itself. If it were, the charity of the wayfarer would not be the same as the charity of heaven. Its object is the thing known, which remains the same, God himself. And we have just finished covering questions 66 and 67 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the equality among the virtues and of the duration of virtues after this life. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.